ribs broken and left in a dry creek to bleed out. A cowboy carried her out and gave her a real bed. A Western romance. The smell hit me before I saw her. Creosote and blood, and something else underneath, some kind of soap or lavender water, way out of place in a dry wash in the middle of August. I'd been riding the cut bank all morning looking for two heifers that had wandered off the night before. My horse Cobb stopped and blew through his nose hard and wouldn't move, and when a horse that's crossed 1,000 dry arroyos won't move, you pay attention to that. I got down. She was wedged in under a lip of red clay about 8 feet below the bank, face up, one arm folded wrong. Couldn't have been there more than a night, the flies were just starting. She was alive. I could see her chest moving, shallow and fast, the way something moves when it hurts to breathe. I stood there a minute, not deciding whether to help. That wasn't a question, that was never a question, not for me. I was reading it. The bank was crumbly red caliche, straight down in a 12-foot drop, and she'd come off the top somehow. Her left side had taken the impact first. You could tell from how she was laying, the angle of her hip against the gravel. The way her left arm was pinned under her versus the right one, which was what concerned me, folded back behind her head at an angle that made my teeth hurt just to look at it. I checked the top of the bank before I went down. No horse, no tracks going away from the edge, just the heel skid in the crumble where she'd gone over. She'd been walking, alone on foot in August, in country where the nearest water was 1.5 miles east. I tied Cobb to a mesquite root and went down the bank on my backside with my boots dug in. Her eyes were closed. She had dark hair, long, loose, caked with red dirt on one side of her face like she'd turned her head in the fall. Her mouth was dry and cracked. She'd been out here in the heat for some of the morning, maybe all of the night before. I put 2 fingers to the side of her neck and found a pulse, steady enough but thin. I ran my hands down her ribs on the left side, just light, just reading it, and she pulled a sharp breath, even unconscious, when I got about halfway down. Broken at minimum 2, maybe 3. And her right arm wasn't broken. I could tell that from the color and the way it lay. It had just folded on impact and got tucked under her when she rolled. I worked it out gently and laid it across her stomach. She didn't stir. The bruise on her jaw was older than the fall. I noted that and put it away. There was a more pressing set of facts in front of me. I said, "All right, I got you," out loud, which was a fool thing to say to somebody who couldn't hear me. I do that sometimes. I've been working alone long enough that I talk to horses and unconscious women and cows stuck in arroyos, and I'm not ashamed of it. Getting her up the bank was the hardest piece of work I did that year. The clay was dry and crumbling, and my boots were not finding good purchase, and I needed both arms for her, which meant no arm for the bank. I had to go backwards, leaning into the slope with her across my chest, one arm under her knees and one under her shoulders, keeping as much of her left side's weight off the ribs as I could manage, and I took it slow. About halfway up she came around. Her eyes opened, unfocused and dark, and she tried to move and made a sound I won't describe in detail, except to say it was the kind of sound that goes straight through a man's chest and stays there. I said, "Don't move, I've got you, just let me carry you." And I don't know if she heard me or if she just had no more fight in her right then, but she went still. By the time we crested the bank, she was out again, and I was glad of it. Saved her from feeling the last 2 feet. I got her to the top, set her down in the thin shade of the mesquite, and took off my hat and poured what was left of my canteen slow over her face and onto her lips. Then I sat on my heels and looked at her and thought. My camp was 4 miles north. The nearest town was 14 miles north of that. The nearest ranch house besides Orville's was about 7 miles west, and I wasn't certain it was occupied this time of year. She had nothing with her, no horse in the vicinity, no pack, no bedroll, nothing. She'd come off that bank on foot, and the direction she'd come from was south, which was flat open country for 20 miles with nothing but that abandoned homestead that had changed hands twice in the last 3 years. I had a decision to make about the arm before I moved her. I felt it again, careful. Not dislocated, I'd seen that before, that particular wrongness, just wrenched and folded. She'd be sore and she might have torn something in the shoulder, but it wasn't out of socket and it wasn't broken. The ribs were the real problem. My camp was 4 miles north, and there was no other option. I got her up on Cobb in front of me, sideways, her good side against my chest, and I kept my right arm across her front and took the reins with my left, and we went slow. Real slow. A man in a hurry on a horse in rough country does damage, and the country here was not smooth. Rocky cutbanks, scrub brush, 2 creek crossings, a stretch of hardpan that would have jarred her bad if I'd let Cobb pick up any pace. We walked most of it. 4 miles is nothing on a good morning. That day it was a long way. She came around fully about halfway there. I knew it because the breathing changed, went from shallow and even to conscious and controlled like she was managing it. She didn't try to sit up or move. She said very quietly, "Where?" I said, "My camp, about 2 miles north. You're going to be all right." She didn't say anything else for a while. Then she said, "Horse." I said, "His name's Cobb. He's steady." She said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. I was glad she wasn't the type to need talking through it. Some people, when they're hurt and scared, they talk and you have to answer everything and keep them calm, and it takes a kind of energy I wasn't sure I had right then. She just lay there against me and breathed and let me carry her, and there was something in that, the trust of it, the plain give over to somebody else's capability, that I felt the weight of and didn't take lightly. My camp was what it was. A canvas shelter off 2 poles, a fire ring with a flat hearthstone I'd dragged in from the creek bed, a cot I'd borrowed from the main house supply shed back in April and never returned. My gear on a flat rock, a feed bag for Cobb hanging off the mesquite I'd tied him to at night. A man's camp, functional, nothing wasted, nothing extra. I'd been running the south pasture since April and I'd stopped thinking about it in terms of comfort. It was a place to sleep between work. I got her down off Cobb, one-handed, holding the saddle horn with the other to keep my balance and her weight from pulling me both over. Set her on the ground for just a moment while I untied the cot's canvas side and laid the flap back, and then I picked her up again and got her onto the cot and laid her down flat. She was lighter than she looked. I noticed that in the way you notice something and file it, information about a person, the kind that tells you something about how they've been living. My name is Dalt Breckenridge. I was 54 years old that August, working leased pasture for a man named Orville Chance who had 20 sections of decent grass south and east of Jasper Wells. Orville paid in full and on time and let me work my own way, which was everything I asked of an employer by that point in my life. I had a good horse and a sound rifle and my health except for some accumulated damage in my right knee that I'd learned to work around. I had a small savings and no debt, and nothing in the world I was owed to anyone. I'd been married once. Her name was Clara, and she'd left 9 years before that August, not because of any single terrible thing, but because of the accumulated weight of a particular kind of life. The moving, the leased places, the alone, and because I had not, for a long stretch of those years, been an easy man to be around. I'll own that. I was harder than I needed to be, quieter than was fair, and I had a way of treating my own solitude like a preference when it was really just a wall I'd built and forgotten the reason for. She went back east to her sister's place, and I heard she'd remarried a year later, somebody with a house in town and a hardware store, and I hoped she was happy with it. I mention this only because it's the shape of the man who found her. And the shape of a man has something to do with what he does next, and how he does it. What I did next was wrap her ribs. I'd done it twice before, once for a hand named Ellis Prudham who'd come off a horse in a rocky draw about 12 years back, and once for myself, a long time before that, in a town I've since stopped saying the name of. I knew the procedure. You get them sitting up if you can manage it, and you get the wrap firm enough to stabilize but loose enough they're not fighting you for air. I had a clean shirt in my pack that I tore into strips and I got her up. I had to put her arm around my neck and lift from that side, slow. And I told her what I was doing before I did it, each thing, which is something Ellis had told me he'd appreciated. People in pain do better when they know what's coming. She was conscious for this one, and she was a particular kind of quiet, not the quiet of someone fading, but the deliberate quiet of someone who has decided to take it and not make it worse than it is. I've seen it before in men, that quality, and I thought highly of it then too. When I cinched the last knot, she let a breath out, long and controlled, and said, "That's better." First clear words she'd spoken. I eased her back down and gave her water in small amounts. Too much too fast, and you're bringing it back up, and went out to tend to Cobb, unsaddle him, feed him, give him water from the collapsible bucket I kept on the saddle. I stood there with my hand on his neck for a minute, and let the adrenaline of the last 3 hours work its way out through my feet into the ground. Then I went back in and made broth from a tin of salt pork and fed it to her with a spoon. Her name was Ruth Callas, She told me that between spoonfuls, between rests, in the flat, even way of someone who's already decided what they're willing to say and what they're not. She'd been walking 3 days from a homestead about 12 miles south. The homestead had been her husband's and her together for 4 years. The husband she referred to in the past tense without explanation. I didn't ask. The bruise on her jaw was from before the fall. I'd already known that. And she didn't mention it, and I didn't mention it, and we both knew. She'd run out of water the morning of the second day. She'd been rationing it wrong, which is a thing most people don't know how to do correctly until they've needed to. By the time she went off the bank, she'd been dry for a day and a half, and the heat had done what heat does. She went asleep before dark, mid-sentence almost, the way bodies do when they've finally been allowed to stop. I sat outside by the fire and drank coffee and looked at the sky going from orange to dark red to black, and I thought about what I was going to do. I had a job. I had obligations to Orville's cattle, to the south fence that needed 3 posts replaced after a flash flood 2 weeks back, to the routine of a working pasture that didn't stop because a man had an unexpected guest. I had 1 cot and 1 set of supplies measured out for 1 man, and no particular plan for any of this. I rolled my bedroll out on the ground under the canvas overhang. The night was warm. I lay on my back on the hard ground and looked up at the canvas and listened to her breathe, slow and steady, in and out, nothing wet or rattling in it, which was what I'd been listening for, and I thought about being useful. About doing a thing that needed doing and doing it right. About how there is sometimes a kind of cleanness in that when everything else is complicated and muddy and full of old losses. You can't fix what's already gone. But you can wrap a woman's ribs and feed her broth and let her sleep, and that's something. That counts. I slept better than I had in a week. She was worse the second morning. That happens with broken ribs. The first day has a quality of numbness to it, shock doing some of the work, and then the inflammation sets in overnight, and the second morning is harder than the first. She was running a fever, low and even, and getting herself upright to drink water required me on one side of her and a slow process of controlled breathing that she handled without complaint. I changed the wrap because it had shifted in the night. I got her sitting up again, same process, and retied it, tighter in 2 places and looser in 1, and she sat there and breathed through it, and when I was done she said, "Better," which was what she'd said the night before, and I was coming to understand meant she was fine and didn't need to talk about it. I brought her water and 2 hard biscuits from my pack and left them within reach. I told her I needed to ride out and check the south fence and look for my strays, and I'd be back by dark. I asked if there was anything she needed before I went. She looked at my rifle on the flat rock. I said, "You want that closer?" And she said yes, and I moved it to the ground right next to the cot where her hand could reach it without her sitting up. She said, "I know how to use it." I said, "I figured you did." She almost said something else and didn't. I rode out. I found the heifers that afternoon about 1.5 miles east, pushed into a brushy draw by the heat, which is what cattle do in August when they're left to their own decisions. I got them back without much trouble. Then I went to the south fence and fixed the 3 washed-out posts, had to dig the footings by hand and set the posts in dry with rock fill because I didn't have cement and wasn't going back for it, and it took me longer than I wanted, which meant the sun was getting low by the time I was done. I rode back fast, which was the fastest I'd ridden all day, and I noted that about myself with some interest. I'd never been one to hurry back to camp. When I came in, I smelled smoke. New smoke, not the banked coals I'd left. She'd gotten up and gotten wood from the stack I kept under the tarp and rebuilt the fire, and she was sitting on the ground next to it. Couldn't sit on my low stool, not with those ribs, that required bending she wasn't ready for, and she'd found a can of beans in my pack and set them close to the flame. I unsaddled Cobb and rubbed him down and hung his feed bag and came over. I said, "You shouldn't have done that." She said, "I know, I needed to do something." I understood that without needing it explained, so I let it go. I got the beans off the flame before they burned, and we ate them with the salt pork and 3 days' worth of stale bread that was still good toasted. And she ate slow and steady and cleaned her plate. And when I asked her how the ribs felt, she said they felt like hell, and I said that was about right for day 2. She was quiet for a while. The fire was down to coals, and the sky was doing its nightly thing, the stars coming in thick the way they do out here away from any town. She said, "You fixed the wrap better this morning." I said I'd done it wrong the first time, too loose in the middle. She said, "You've done it before." I said twice. She said, at wrapping ribs or at picking women out of dry creek beds. The corner of her mouth moved, just the corner. I didn't smile back, I'm not a man who smiles quickly, but I felt it land somewhere in my chest, and it was a good landing. I said just the ribs. She said, all right. And she went back to looking at the fire, and so did I. And it was a comfortable enough silence for two people who'd known each other less than 48 hours and had no particular history between them except the one we'd made in the last 2 days. The 4th day she could sit up on her own without help. The 5th day she walked to the spring, a half-mile east, good water that ran most of the summer off some limestone formation I'd never found the top of, and came back and had washed her hair. She stood at the edge of camp in the late afternoon, her hair loose and damp and dark in the slant light, and she had that look that some people get when they've been through something and come out the other side intact, and they're just beginning to believe that. I was mending a piece of tack. The stitching had gone on a saddlebag flap, and I looked up once and then looked back at what I was doing. You know a man named Orville Chance, she said. I said I worked for him. She said she'd known his wife Mabel from church, years back, before Ruth had moved south with her husband. The way she said, moved south with her husband, had the quality of a thing said in a certain way on purpose, flat and clean, the door closed on it. She said he ever hire women. I told her his cook had just given notice. That it was a camp cook job, not a house job, but it paid real wages and he was a fair employer and ran an orderly outfit. She said, you think he'd take me on, knowing the circumstances. I thought about Orville. I'd worked for him 3 years and I'd watched him hire a one-armed Mexican vaquero who'd been turned away by 2 other ranches, and a boy who'd done a year in county jail for something minor he'd owned up to straight, and an old Comanche man who spoke maybe 40 words of English and didn't need to speak more. Orville hired people who could do the work. The circumstances of their arrival was their business, not his. I told her that. She said, all right. And she came and sat down on the flat rock across from me and picked up the bit of leather I'd already done and looked at my stitch work and didn't say anything about it, which I took as a good sign. I need to stop here and tell you something true, which is that the week she was in my camp was the strangest week I'd had in a long time. Not bad strange. Just different in a way I didn't have a word for. I'd been alone for long enough that I'd stopped thinking of it as being alone. I'd reclassified it, somewhere in my 50s, into something like preference. Men who work the land on their own schedules, who wake up when they wake up and move when they move and don't have to explain themselves to anyone, that's not a small thing. I valued it. I'd organized my life to have it, and it was genuine, I wasn't pretending. But having her in that camp rearranged something, and it did it quietly so that I didn't notice it happening. It wasn't that she was loud or demanding, she was neither. She was about as self-sufficient as a wounded woman with 2 broken ribs could be, and she didn't require being entertained or reassured or tended to constantly. But her presence changed the texture of the air, the way a fire changes a room even when you're not looking at it. I found I was planning meals differently, thinking about what she might be able to eat with the ribs, what would take less work to chew, what had more in it. I found I was coming back to camp with a purpose I didn't have before. I found I was aware of small things, whether she'd moved since morning, whether she'd eaten, whether the fever had stayed down, in a way that reminded me of a time earlier in my life when I'd been responsible for somebody besides myself. And the memory of that wasn't painful exactly, but it had weight. I didn't say any of this out loud. I just went about my work in my evenings and I let it be what it was. On the 6th night, she asked me about myself. We were outside after supper, as we'd gotten to doing better outside, where the air moved than under the canvas in the heat, and she said, "Where are you from, Dalt?" I said all over, grew up in Kansas, been west since I was 19. She said, "What brought you west?" I said the usual things. Work, movement, the general drawing west that a certain kind of young man experiences and can't fully explain. She said, "Were you ever not alone?" I looked at her. She was looking at the fire, not at me, and there was nothing pointed or prying in the question. She was just asking, in the plain way she asked things. I said I was married. 9 years ago she went back east. She said, "Was it bad after?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "It was quiet, too quiet for a while, then it became a different kind of quiet." She understood the distinction. I could tell from the way she sat with it. She said mine was never quiet enough, and then she stopped and she said, "I don't mean to." I said, "You can say what's true." She looked at me then, a longer look than she usually gave. She said, "4 years is a long time to be afraid of a man in your own house." I said, "Yes." She looked back at the fire. I looked at the fire. We sat with it for a while. She said, "I'm not afraid now." I said, "No, I can see that." And she wasn't. That was the thing about her, whatever had happened south of here, however it had ended and under what circumstances she'd come walking out of it on foot into August heat, it hadn't broken her. She was cracked, same as the ribs, and healing, same as the ribs, but the thing underneath was whole. I took her to Orville's on the 8th day. She said she thought she could ride, and I thought so too. I'd been planning it since the 6th day, but hadn't said so, waiting for her to be ready enough that the 4-mile ride to Jasper Wells for the doctor wouldn't set her back. We broke camp at first light. I'd loaded my pack the night before, everything but the cot, which I was leaving for the pasture, and I helped her up onto Cobb. She said, "You're walking." I said the terrain was rough for the first few miles, and Cobb was already carrying her. She said, "Dalt, you can ride behind me. I won't break." I said, "Wait for the flat country." She gave me a look that had some exasperation in it, which was the most expression she'd used on me yet, and I found I appreciated it. We went slow. 3 miles of rough country, me on foot with the lead rope, her steady in the saddle and straight-backed, taking each step with that controlled breathing I'd come to recognize. When the land flattened out, I got up behind her and took the reins, and she leaned back careful, ribs clear, and we went north at a walking pace with the morning coming up gold on the grass to the east. She fell asleep around mid-morning. I know because I felt it. Her head dropped back against my shoulder, and her whole body went the particular loose of real sleep, not the careful half-rest she'd been doing. I kept Cobb steady and didn't shift and let her sleep. The hawk I'd been watching make circles off to the east was still at it. Same thermal probably, just drifting around and around in the blue-white sky, and I watched it and held us even. She slept for about 40 minutes. When she woke, she said, "Sorry," and I said, "Don't be." She didn't move from my shoulder right away. Just woke up and looked at the country ahead, and I was looking at the same thing, and for a minute we were just two people looking at the same grass and sky from the same horse, and there was something ordinary and right about it that I didn't disturb. Orville Chance was a broad man, 60 years old, with a white mustache and the permanent slight squint of someone who'd spent 4 decades looking into long distances. He came out of the cook tent when he heard us, wiping his hands on his trousers, and he looked at her and then at me and said, "Dalt, what have you got?" It wasn't quite a question. He said it like a man who'd seen some things arrive on his doorstep over the years and had learned to read the category before he heard the details. I gave him the short version. He stood still and listened. Orville was the best listener I'd ever worked for. He didn't move, didn't nod, didn't make noises to indicate he was receiving the information. He just took it in. When I was done, he looked at her directly, not unkindly, with a frank appraisal, and he said, "Ruth Callas, Mabel's Ruth from church." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Mabel'll want to see you," and then, without pause, "I need a cook. My last one pulled out 2 weeks ago, and I've been making do. You any good at it?" She said, "Good enough for a working camp." He looked at her a moment, reading something in her face or her posture or some combination. He said, "Pays 20 a month. You get your own tent, one of the good ones, not the surplus. Camp's orderly. I run an orderly camp and the boys know it." She said that suited her. He looked at me. I didn't say anything because I didn't need to. He said, "Get her into Jasper Wells for the doctor before you come back here." I said I'd planned to. He nodded and went back into the cook tent, and that was the whole conversation. That was Orville. The doctor in Jasper Wells was a young man named Prout, 28 or 30, who had an office above Calloway's general store that smelled of tobacco and carbolic in equal measure. He asked no questions that weren't medical, which I appreciated, and he examined her with a matter-of-factness that I also appreciated, thorough and impersonal, the way good doctoring should be. He confirmed 2 ribs broken and 1 cracked. He said I'd wrapped them correctly, which I won't pretend I didn't feel good about. He said there was nothing more to do for them than rest and time and keeping the wrap dry, and he gave her a small bottle of something for the pain, and told her the shoulder was wrenched but not torn and would take another 3 weeks to stop bothering her. He charged $1.75. I paid it while Ruth was buttoning her shirt, and she said, "I'll pay you back." And I said, "There's no hurry," which was my way of saying it didn't matter, which she understood. There was a boarding house on the north end of town, the Halloran place, that I knew kept decent rooms. I'd stayed there once 2 winters before when a blizzard had come in fast while I was in town for supplies, and I'd been stuck for 3 days. Clean beds and hot meals, and Mrs. Halloran, who ran it like a school, but a fair school. I got Ruth a room for 2 nights. Prute had said she needed proper rest before the ride back to Orville's. Mrs. Halloran took us up herself and unlocked the door, and Ruth stepped in and stopped in the doorway. It was a plain room, iron bed, washstand, a window looking onto the main street. Faded yellow curtains on the window, the kind of calico that's been washed enough times to go soft and pale. She stood there a moment too long, just looking at it. At the curtains, particularly, which caught the afternoon light and went gold at the edges. I didn't say anything. Mrs. Halloran left us, and I told Ruth I'd go get her some food from the restaurant across the street. She said she could go herself. I said she'd been on a horse for 4 hours and she was going to sit down. She said I didn't need to feed her anymore. I said I was going to anyway. She said, "Dalt." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You've been," and she stopped. I waited. She said, "I don't have words for it, what you did. The whole of it." I said, "You don't need words for it." She said, "You could have left me in that creek bed. You could have got me up and pointed me to the road and gone back to your cows. You didn't have to." I said, "Yes, I did." She looked at me, I looked back. I said, "That's just what that was just what was called for." I said it as plain as I could because I meant it plain. It wasn't a gift, it wasn't a favor, it wasn't something she owed me for. It was what the situation required, and I was the man standing in the situation, and I had done it. That was the whole accounting of it. She said, "You're a different kind of man, Dalt Breckenridge." I said, "I'm a regular kind of man who happened to be in the right place." She said, "No," quiet and even. "You're not." I went and got her a plate of stew and bread from the restaurant and brought it up and set it on the washstand. She was already on the bed, boots off, her feet out straight, looking at the window. The yellow curtains moved a little in the late afternoon air. I said, "Eat before it goes cold." She said, "Yes, sir." I went out. I went back to the south pasture and my work and my cot on the ground and did what I was supposed to do. The heifers, the fence, the routine. September came in cooler, the nights turning sharp at the edges, and I pulled my wool coat out of the pack where I'd been keeping it since May and started wearing it mornings and evenings. I rode up to Orville's main camp on Sundays for supplies. That was my established schedule. I'd been doing it all summer. The first Sunday I went up after Jasper Wells, Ruth was in the cook tent, and there was a smell coming from it that was not the smell of Orville's previous cook, who had been a competent enough man, but not what you'd call inspired. There was something with onions and beef, and what I eventually determined was a dried chili of some kind that she'd found in the supply stores. And the 4 hands who worked Orville's main outfit were sitting outside the tent in various degrees of contentment that men develop when they've been eating camp food for weeks, and somebody suddenly starts actually cooking. Orville met me at the corral. He said, "You did me a favor." I said she'd done herself a favor. He said also that, but still. I got my supplies and ate Sunday dinner with the outfit and rode back. Ruth served and didn't say much, but when I was getting my hat to go, she was at the tent entrance and she said, "Same time next Sunday." I said that was my schedule. She said, "Good." It was a Sunday in October when she touched me first. We'd gotten into the habit of sitting outside after the hands went to bed and Orville turned in. I'd been staying later than I needed to. I knew it, and probably Orville knew it, though he said nothing. And we'd been sitting out there with the last of the coffee and talking, or not talking, in the particular easy rhythm of 2 people who'd started to find each other's silences comfortable. She'd been telling me about her father, who'd run a small spread west of Abilene and who had, by her account, been a patient and precise man who had taught her everything about horses and cooking and how to read weather, and nothing at all about how to choose a husband. She was telling a story about a mule he'd had, an unreasonable mule with a gift for getting through fences, and she got to the end of the story and she laughed. A real laugh, not the small corner-of-mouth thing I'd seen a few times, but actual laughter, and it changed her face entirely, made her younger and harder to look away from. The laugh quieted. She reached over without looking at me and put her hand on top of mine where it was resting on my knee. I didn't move. She didn't move. She wasn't looking at me and I wasn't looking at her. We were both looking at the fire dying down, and her hand was on my hand, and the night was cold and clear and completely quiet except for the fire. After a while she said quietly, "You're a good man, Dalt Breckenridge." I didn't say anything to that. I turned my hand over and held hers, and she held mine back. We sat there until the fire went to coals and the cold drove us in. That was all. That was the whole of it. But I rode back to the south pasture that night with the stars very bright and very clear overhead, and something in my chest that I had not felt in a long time, and that I had, somewhere in my 50s, given up believing I'd feel again. That was enough. November is when she came to me. I'd been fighting a chest infection for 2 weeks, and not telling anyone because there was no one to tell, and I was used to managing my own troubles. It had gotten deep by the second week, into the lungs, which is when it stops being something you sweat out and starts being something that can kill you if you let it go long enough. And I knew that, but I'd decided the knowing was sufficient, and that I'd manage it, which was the kind of decision a man makes when he has been alone long enough that he's stopped accounting for the possibility of help. I'd missed 2 Sundays without a word. I hadn't thought about what that meant from the outside, from her position. I was inside the fever, and I wasn't thinking past the immediate problem, which was getting through the day. She came on a Tuesday. I don't know exactly how she found me. She'd never been to the South Pasture camp. I'd never taken her. But I found out later she'd asked one of Orville's hands who'd ridden out that way in the fall, and he described the camp well enough. She came on one of Orville's mares, and she had a pack behind the saddle, and she found me flat on the cot at 9 in the morning, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of things because I was never in bed at 9 in the morning. She stood in the entry of the canvas shelter and said, "Dalt." I said, "Ruth." My voice had gone rough and low. She said, "How long have you been down?" I said, "Few days." She said, "Few days." The way you repeat a thing that you want to make clear you know is a lie. She came in and put the back of her hand to my forehead and then to my neck, and then she unpacked the saddlebag, and there was real medicine in it, not camp kit, but a proper bottle of something from Prutt's and food, and a blanket, and a jar of some broth she'd made and stoppered with cloth. She gave me the medicine first and then sat on the edge of the cot and watched me drink the broth, the same way I'd spooned salt pork broth into her in August. I said, "You didn't have to come all the way down here." She said, "Don't say that to me." I said, "What?" She said, "That I didn't have to. Don't say it. I came because I wanted to and because you were sick and because—" She stopped. She said, "Because you're mine, Dalt, that's why. If you're going to be mine, you have to let someone take care of you when you're down." I looked at her, she looked back. I said, "I didn't know I was yours." She said, "Now you know." She stayed 3 days. The bedroll on the ground again, same as I'd done in August, symmetrical in a way I might have found funny if I hadn't been mostly delirious for the first day and a half. She gave me medicine twice a day, woke me up to drink water, fed me whatever I could keep down. On the second morning, when the fever spiked and I was shaking and couldn't keep anything down and the world had gone to a gray spinning thing with no edges, she sat on the edge of the cot and put her hand flat on my chest, just resting it there, just the warm pressure of it, and she said, "You're going to be fine. Stay here, stay with me." I stayed. By the third day I was sitting up and keeping food down and the fever had broken. I was hollow and weak, but through it. She was washing up at the fire ring, her back to me, and I said, "You came." She said, "Yes." I said, "I didn't expect it." She turned around and looked at me across the camp and she said, "I know you didn't. You need to start expecting it." She said it without anger, just plain, the way she said most things. "That's what this is. You need to understand that." I said, "All right." She said, "All right." And that was that, in the way the important things between us were always that, plain and fast and said once. We got married in April. The county clerk's office in Jasper Wells, a thin man with a red mustache who read from a card, while the afternoon light came through the window and Orville and Mabel Chance stood next to us, and Mabel cried in the quiet way she had. Ruth wore a blue dress she'd made herself from cloth she'd bought in town in February. She had her hair up with pins, and the set of her jaw that I knew by then meant she had decided on a thing and was doing it and was satisfied. We said what we were supposed to say. The clerk stamped the paper. Orville shook my hand and said, 9 months, and I said, give me some credit, and he said, I do. And he meant it in more than one direction, which is why I valued Orville. On the boardwalk outside, with the main street of Jasper Wells going about its business around us, Ruth put her hand on my arm, and I put my hand over hers, and we stood there for a moment in the April sun, and it was the most settled I had felt in a long time. Maybe since before Clara, maybe longer than that. We had supper that night at the same restaurant where I'd got her stew in September. The same chairs, probably. She ordered the same thing I did without looking at the menu because we'd both been on camp food long enough that we just wanted a real meal and nowhere pressing to be. She said, you remember when you brought me up to the Halloran place? I said I did. She said, I stood in that doorway too long. I said I noticed. She said, the curtains. He never let me put curtains up, said it was a waste. I used to think about curtains. She said it with no particular weight, just a fact now. I thought about them for 4 years. I said, that's not stupid. She said, no, I know that now. She put her hand on mine on the table. The restaurant around us was busy and nobody was looking at us. She said, I'm going to put curtains on every window in whatever house we end up in. I said, everyone. She said, don't make fun. I said, I'm not. We have a place now, leased from Orville with option to buy 40 acres of decent grass and a 2-room house that needed work when we got into it and is better now. I've been on this land 4 years, and I intend to be on it until I can't be anymore. Ruth cooks for Orville's outfit through the week, and I work this land and my part of Orville's range, same as before mostly, except I come home on Friday evenings to a lit window and a fire going. She gets back from the main camp on Saturdays. We have Saturday evening and Sunday, and then the week starts again, and it sounds like not much, and it is not nothing. She put curtains on every window, blue and yellow, the first week. I came in from feeding the horses one evening, and she was up on a chair hanging the last one in the front room, and she got it straight and stepped down and stood back and looked at it with that look she gets when something is exactly where it ought to be. Then she turned around, and she saw me standing in the doorway watching her, and she didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at me with that same look she'd given the curtain, like I was in the same category, something in the right place in the right light, and then she crossed the room and put her hands on either side of my face, and she kissed me, which she does not do frivolously. When Ruth does a thing, she means it. I think about August sometimes. The hawk making long circles off to the east. The way the camp smelled at night, sage and dust and cold air coming in from the plains. The weight of her in my arms coming up that clay bank, the way she went still and trusted me to do it, the sound she'd made. There are things you carry from a moment like that, not because they were beautiful, they weren't, particularly, but because something true happened in them, something clear. She could have broken, and she didn't, and I could have left her, and I didn't. And neither of those facts is the more important one. They both matter the same. They're the same kind of fact about what a person is made of when they're down to the bottom of what they have. What I didn't expect was this. A woman who would come find me when I was the one down. A woman who would say, you're mine, to a man who'd been operating for years on the assumption that he was nobody's, as a kind of settled fact about the world. It wasn't a thing I'd asked for. It wasn't a thing I'd have known to want. But here we are. The evening is coming down gold and flat across the pasture right now, and Cobb is somewhere in the south corner being a horse with no concerns. And from the other room I can hear her moving around, the quiet sounds of a person in their own house who knows where everything is. And in a few minutes she'll come to the doorway, and she'll see me sitting here with this cup of cold coffee that I've been ignoring, and she'll shake her head, and take it from me and pour a warm one without being asked, and set it down in front of me, and probably put her hand on my shoulder for just a moment on her way back, just in passing, just to mark where I am in the room. She does that, she's done that for 4 years. I've never once taken it for granted. Some men get to the end of their working years with nothing but the work. I did too, for a long time, and I won't tell you it was all suffering because it wasn't. There's a dignity in being good at a thing, and I was good at my thing, and I knew it, and that counts. But this is different. This is what it's like to be seen by a particular person, and to have her stay because she wants to, and to have carried her out of a dry creek bed once and had her carry you back a few months later, and to understand that that's the whole deal. That's what it looks like between two people who are both willing. She's coming. I can hear her in the hallway. The light through the curtains is going orange. Approx 60 min narration.